For our final presentation today, we are pleased to welcome Cynthia Mcdonald. Cynthia Mcdonald is a health enthusiast and is passionate about helping others, which led her to a career in social work. She holds a Bachelor of Science and certification in community health. She authors a blog called ADOS Health and Wellness, which speaks on the social determinants of health of Black Americans that descend from chattel slavery. She also hosts a social political podcast called The 13%, a pop culture podcast called Chronicles of a Revolutionary Nerd, and is a regular host on the Nonprofits Show, produced by the atheist community of Austin, of which she is also a member. Cynthia also serves as the General Secretary of ADOS Chicago and is also a musician that writes, records, and performs dance and house music. Cynthia?
Gotta take the mask off. I just want to preface my bio really quickly. I think I sent you the old one, Mendes, I'm sorry. My blog is actually called Freedmen Health and Wellness. And I am the General Secretary of the Freedmen Descendants of Chicago. All right. So thank you for that warm introduction. I want to first say that I am honored and humbled that I was invited by the great Mendiza Thomas to address you today. I never thought in a million years I would be asked to come before such an accomplished group of people to speak on something I'm very passionate about. I could not, however, continue to address you without giving acknowledgement to Mendiza and the Black nonbelievers for all the hard work they do. Mendiza, I've told you before, I am a huge fan. And I'm grateful to you and to the work of your organization. Finding the Black nonbelievers was integral because it helped me find a community of other Black atheists, skeptics, agnostics, and humanists, and let me know I am not alone. So please, everyone, give a round of applause to Mendiza and the Black nonbelievers. I believe in giving people their flowers while they can still smell them. James Baldwin, author, poet, activist, and sharp critic of the church, once said, "I love America more than any other country in this world, and exactly for this reason, I insist on criticizing her perpetually." He also said to accept one's past, one's history, is not the same thing as drowning in it. It is learning how to use it. An invented past can never be used. It cracks and crumbles under the pressures of life like clay in a season of drought. Activism in this space happens because although one may love the land they are from, does not mean the land has always loved them. It also means that if I do love this land, I must speak up when it's wrong and has wrought harm to its first citizens. I use the term first citizens not as an insult to those who have come before or who have immigrated after America was established. I use that term because what we know of how we determine citizenship was as a result of the ending of slavery and the adoption of the 14th Amendment. The opening sentence of Section 1 of the 14th Amendment defines US citizenship as all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. There are certain rights that comes with citizenship, such as freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, the right to petition the government, and freedom of liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Citizenship also comes with responsibilities such as supporting and defending the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, staying informed of issues affecting your community, participating in the democratic process, example, voting, respecting and obeying federal, state, and local laws, and respecting the rights, beliefs, and opinions of others. African Americans that were either enslaved or the descendants of the enslaved have kept the responsibilities of what is expected of a citizen, yet the rights and privileges that come with such a title have not always been extended to us. African Americans have supported and defended the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, because we have fought in every war. I myself am a daughter of a Korean War veteran, and I am a great-granddaughter of a World War I veteran. African Americans stay informed of the issues that affect our community because we are still living under the legacies of slavery and Jim Crow. African Americans have participated in every election since we were given the right to vote, yet we still face voting suppression in numerous states and municipalities. African Americans obey the laws of the land, yet are incarcerated more than 5 times the rate of whites and at least 10 times the rate in 5 states. According to a study published by NYU Steinhardt and NYU CUSP and the Stanford Open Policing Project in 2020, Black drivers are about 20% more likely to be stopped than white drivers relative to their share of the residential population. The study also found that once stopped, Black drivers were searched about 1.5 to 2 times as often as white drivers, while they were less likely to be carrying drugs, guns, or other illegal contraband compared to their white peers. Also, according to a study by researchers from Harvard T. Chan School of Public Health, Black Americans are 3.23 times more likely than white Americans to be killed by police. Another indicator of the privileges that come with citizenship is the opportunity to create and pass on generational wealth. Right before the March on Washington, Dr. King addressed a group of activists and organizers. He reminded them of the purpose of the march in the nation's capital. Often, most people think Dr. King was there so he can speak about his dream. Components of that speech are often misused, misquoted, or misrepresented. The last misuse and misrepresentation I've witnessed was from Ken Ham and his panel from Answers from Genesis. King reminded his folks that this march is about gaining full citizenship status, which includes a proper share of wealth and economic inclusion. Quote, "At the same time, when America refused to give the Negro any land through an act of Congress, our government was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest. It meant that it was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor. But not only did they give the land, they built land-grant colleges with government money to teach them how to farm. Not only that, they provided low interest rates in order for them to mechanize their farms. Not only that, today, many of these people are receiving millions of dollars in subsidies not to farm, and they are the very people telling the Black man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps." Now, this is what we are faced with, and this is the reality. Now, when we come to Washington in this campaign, we're coming to get our check. King was referring to a policy called the Homestead Act of 1862. This particular policy lasted for over 114 years. The government granted more than 270 millions of acres of land while the law was in effect. The passage of the Federal Land Policy and Management Act of 1976 repealed the Homestead Act in the 48 contiguous states, but it did grant a 10-year extension on the claims in Alaska. By 1934, well over 1.5 million white families, born American and immigrant, eventually profited from it. And although the process was rife with fraud, as many homesteaders sold their plots to corporations, the original claimants pocketed the income from land sales, establishing a basis of wealth and capital. About 6,000 Black families were able to take advantage of the policy, but most of them lost their land through land theft, lynchings, and the like. Enforcement of previous policies like the Oregon Land Donation Act of 1850 barred Black citizens from owning land and real estate. In 1866, shortly after the end of the Civil War, the Southern Homestead Act, or the SHA, was supposed to function much like the original act. During the first year of the SHA, unoccupied Southern land was offered exclusively to African Americans and loyal whites. But after 1867, even the landless former Confederates applied. You can guess what happened afterwards. This one act of Congress has approximately 48 million white Americans living today off of the wealth from that one policy. Companies like Cargill and Purdue exist because of the Homestead Act. Colleges like USC exist because of the Homestead Act. The United States has used policy countless times to create wealth in predominantly white communities. Policies like the New Deal, enacted in 1933, largely went to whites and excluded Blacks. The GI Bill, enacted in 1944, was enacted towards the end of World War II. This policy was to give economic assistance to veterans, for example, to get a house, invest in a business, or to pay for college. Unfortunately, the management of this policy was given to the states, and Black soldiers coming home from the war were often denied this benefit and never told why. An example is the state of Mississippi only granting 2 Black veterans the GI Bill when it first was enacted. Some 1.2 million Black men served in the military during that war. 237,000 soldiers were from Mississippi, and a large contingency of those soldiers were Black. Why does this matter? I'm glad you asked. Oftentimes the question is raised, what is wrong with Black people? What about Black on Black crime? What about Black gangs? What about the marriage rate being so low? What about Chicago? What about this? What about that? The whataboutisms are what I like to call the symptoms of the disease. I also like to call them work avoidance. Since I hit you with a little history of economic injustice, let's delve into the wonderful world of statistics. Currently, Black Americans own less than 2% of the wealth in the United States. The median income of an African-American household is roughly $30,000 to $43,000 versus the median income of white households being around $65,000. The estimate median wealth of Black households is $36,000, not liquid. While white households estimate their parents' median wealth at $150,000. A Black household median income with the head of the house with a bachelor's is roughly $15,000 less than the head of a household that is white without a high school diploma. According to the Economic Institute policy, African Americans' median household income and wealth is lower than all racial and ethnic groups. Even with this myth that African Americans have the spending power of $1.3 trillion is a fallacy. The number was based on self-reporting surveys and the combined incomes of African Americans for approximately a year. If you did not know by now, income does not equate to wealth. and it damn sure does not mean buying power. So what now? How is this going to be solved? The only way this is going to be solved is by how the government always solved the issue of groups of people coming into wealth: policy. Massive economic policy, and that policy specifically for the injured group, is reparations. This can only be achieved through what leading reparations scholar and Duke University professor Dr. William Darity calls ARC: acknowledge, redress, and closure. So before we go into ARC, I think it's important to define reparations. You know, atheists always want to define myths and, and things of that nature. Can we define these terms before we actually go through our debate? Merriam-Webster defines reparations as a repairing or keeping in repair, the act of making amends, offering expiation, or giving satisfaction for a wrong or injury. Something done or given as amends or satisfaction. The Encyclopedia Britannica defines reparations as a levy on a defeated country, forcing it to pay some of the war costs of the winning countries. Reparations was levied on the Central Powers after World War I to compensate the Allies for some of their war costs. The best example of the latter definition is when Germany was forced to pay reparations to Jewish Holocaust victims and their descendants if the victim did not survive. Other countries who were also complicit in this behavior also paid reparations, like France and Croatia. When the Civil War ended, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman met with former slaves that were pastors and other leaders in their community and asked them what they wanted. They told him land that they could work and farm on their own. On January 16, 1865, during the American Civil War, he issued Special Field Orders number 15, a wartime order to allot some to those freed families in plots of land no larger than 40 acres. That wartime order was rescinded and redistributed back to the former slave owners after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson becoming president of the United States. Those land grants alone would have been worth at least $6.4 trillion in today's money. Another econ PhD candidate told me recently the land grants would have been worth up to $19 trillion in today's money. America has actually acknowledged its malfeasance. On July 29, 2008, the U.S. House of Representatives issued an apology to Black Americans for the institution of slavery and the subsequent Jim Crow laws for the years discriminated against Blacks and as second-class citizens in American society. Representative Steve Cohen, Democrat from Tennessee, issued the resolution, and it had 120 co-sponsors. Along with that acknowledgement, President Joe Biden signed into law recently Juneteenth as a national holiday, acknowledging the last of the enslaved to be told in Galveston, Texas, the war was over and they are free. So the United States, is already very aware of their complacency, and despite the recent laws in various states banning the teaching of critical race theory, or what I like to call teaching actual history, it would not negate the fact that America has done a deep injustice and harm to Black Americans. In the spirit of Dr. King, not only that, America is also liable for other policies that cause great harm to our community, like convict leasing, land theft, domestic terrorism, lynching, redlining, the war on drugs, mass incarceration, multiple Black towns where residents were massacred, and whole townships underwater, to environmental racism such as Flint, Michigan water, or Cancer Alley in Louisiana. All of this blood is on America's hands, yet we have yet to see any attempt to redress and repair. So what does redress and repair look like? Dr. Darity, who I've mentioned previously, stated in an article from BU Today, redress is the actual form that restitution might take, and I've argued that in any program of reparations, it's important that restitution must include, in some significant way, direct payments to eligible recipients. So who is eligible? Dr. Darity's criteria, which I agree with, is a person who identifies as Black or African American for at least 12 years before a reparations program is enacted and can trace their lineage to the institution of chattel slavery at least through one ancestor. Some have argued that this is an arduous task. I'm here to tell you that it's not. According to the Smithsonian, before 1965, Black people of foreign birth residing in the United States were nearly invisible. According to the 1960 census, their percentage of the population was to the right of the decimal point. But after 1965, men and women of African descent entered the United States in ever-increasing numbers. During the 1990s, some 900,000 Black immigrants came from the Caribbean, and another 400,000 came from Africa. Still others came from Europe and the Pacific Rim. Also, as an antidote, not only am I descended from chattel slavery, I am also a descendant of Black immigrants. First, second, and so on generations of Black immigrants know where we hail. The United States Census from 1870s is the first census to name all former slaves. Using census records constitutes indirect evidence to the institution of chattel slavery. Also, it is noteworthy that there are still other documents like bill of sales and slave records that have survived. Dr. Darity proposes in his book he co-wrote with A. Kirsten Mullins, From Here to Equality, that part of a reparations program would be for the federal government to set up an office to help those who have claim to find substantiating documents to confirm their lineage to chattel slavery. At the heart of any reparations program should be to address and close the racial wealth gap. As I mentioned earlier, I shared historical examples of multiple infractions that caused the chasm that exists today. It is only through direct payments, economic building programs, and protections implemented can address this crisis that Black freedmen descendants macroly face. As I stated before, Black Americans own less than 2% of the wealth in the United States versus white Americans owning only over 90%. During the pandemic in 2020, 41% of Black businesses closed versus 17% of white businesses. This is a direct result of not having capital to keep one's business afloat during perilous times. It is absolutely paramount to create this economic floor for African Americans. According to AmericanProgress.org, the persistent Black white wealth gap is the result of discriminatory economic systems that keep Black households from achieving the American dream. The system has always made it difficult for Black households to acquire and keep capital, and this lack of capital has created a persistently large racial wealth disparity, as African Americans have had less wealth to pass on to the next generation than white households. There are several other obstacles to building wealth. Black workers often face labor market discrimination, including being steered towards occupations that are less secure, lower paying, and have fewer benefits and career advancement opportunities. These systematic obstacles to gaining access to good jobs are especially prevalent in the private sector. Opportunities to contribute to and benefit from innovation and advancements in technologies, and thus building wealth in high value added industries and occupations, are also limited for African American innovators and entrepreneurs, as the federal government research funding regularly excludes them. Black households end up with lower incomes and less wealth than white households as a result. The financial system strips Black households of their wealth by denying them access to the same investment opportunities and affordable credit that white households have. This systematic bias makes it more difficult for Black households to participate in the stock market, to start and grow their own business, and to put away for a rainy day fund while they carry costlier debt, such as car loans, credit card balances, and payday loans at the same time. Black households continue to face housing market discrimination, which makes it harder for them to own a home in the first place, and their houses appreciate less in wealth and than those of white households, less in value rather than those of white households. Additional factors such as systematically worse treatment in education, healthcare, in the criminal justice system also feed into the persistent Black white wealth gap. That's an alliteration for you. Amid the fallout from the pandemic, state and local governments have made deep cuts to the public sector, and Black workers have seen economic gains thanks to their hard work in the public sector. These income and wealth gains are now at risk. Again, in September 2020, 211,000 fewer Black workers had a job in the public sector than was the case in September 2019. A reparations program should encompass all of these factors to create a pathway of making a group of people whole. Support for education, support for entrepreneurial activity, and some resources that go into historically Black colleges and universities is absolutely necessary. But the preponderance of the funds must go to the individual's recipients. And they must go in such a way that we, in fact, eliminate the racial gap, the racial wealth gap. That should be a big objective of the reparations project. So now let's discuss closure. Malcolm X said, if you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches, that's not progress. If you pull it all the way out, that's not progress. He goes on to say is that they haven't pulled out the knife out. They won't even admit that it's there. According to Dr. Darity, closure is an agreement on the part of both parties, that the culpable party and the victimized party, that the debt has been paid. But I want to be clear that closure, in essence, does not mean forgetting. An important dimension of reparations program must address issues concerning the memory of the events that led to the reparations commitment. Unfortunately, a proper conversation about closure cannot be had until the metaphoric knife is acknowledged in the body politic that matters. We have seen piecemeal policies proposed, signed into law, benign neglect, and the like. Affirmative action, which was a policy to help minorities be added to the work and education spaces, has mostly assisted white women. The 13th Amendment still allows for the enslavement of convicted felons, and one is already aware that of the disproportionate rate of Black men in US prisons. Black men are roughly 6% of the population, but they make up roughly 41% of the prison population. How? Even with the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964, Dr. King said, until we commit ourselves to ensuring that the underclass is giving justice and opportunity, we will continue to perpetuate the anger and violence that tears the soul of this nation. I fear I'm integrating my people into a burning house. Also in the spirit of Dr. King, oftentimes faith leaders are credited with leading in this space of social justice. But what good has it done us? Even though one cannot deny the organizing of efforts of churches along with organizations like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Black wealth is still at the bottom. Despite the ills we as a group have experienced, God is awfully silent concerning our plight, even though according to Pew Research, 79% of Black Americans identify as Christian. Blacks are still disproportionately killed by police. Black infant mortality rate is 2.3 times higher than whites. At every social and economic statistic, Blacks still find themselves at the bottom except for one, our God belief. Black theology has gone through periods of speaking on redemption of the Negro, liberation of the Negro, and as of late, the prosperity of the Negro. Redemption of the Negro often spoke of laying down one's burdens down by the riverside, or when one gets to heaven, all the pain of this life will just magically disappear. Liberation often spoke of principally a moral reaction to poverty and social injustice. It attempts to liberate people from marginalized communities from multiple forms of political, social, economic, and religious subjugation, and views Christian theology as a theology of liberation. A rational study of the being of God in the world in light of the existential situation of an oppressed community, relating the forces of liberation to the essence of the gospel, which is Jesus Christ. And prosperity theology views the Bible as a contract between God and humans. If humans have faith in God, he would deliver security and prosperity. The doctrine emphasizes the importance of personal empowerment, proposing that if God's will for his people is God's will for his people to be blessed, highly favored. You know, how are you today, ma'am? Well, I'm blessed and highly favored. Are you really? The atonement, reconciliation with God, is interpreted to include the alleviation of sickness and poverty, which are viewed as curses to be broken by faith. This is believed to be achieved through donations of money, visualization, and positive confession. Will a man rob God? Yet ye have robbed me. Where have ye robbed me? In that tithes and that offerings. Bring ye the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meats in my house, and prove me now herewith, saith the Lord of hosts, that I will not open up a window in heaven and pour out a blessing. So much room that it's not enough for you to receive. Pressed down, shaken together, running over, men shall give into your bosom. I'm known for my preacher voice on the nonprofits, by the way. These are all forms of apologetics to continue to believe and serve a silent and apathetic God that has done nothing to change the position of Black Americans. I conjecture he is also quite absent at the southern border as well. It's time for a new approach. I had a discourse with a Black conservative. I know, I'm okay though. He told me that the reason for all these abysmal statistics is because of how we think. Yeah, you know, just think better, you'll be all right. But I can't completely dismiss that. Often hoping, wishing, and praying for a deity that there is no empirical evidence exists to save our community is a bad approach. I am of the ilk that wants to believe as many true things as possible and not believe in things that are not true. If one thing that any civil rights leader that was effective in their advocacy taught us is that none of the things that we desire on the macro level can be achieved without a political solution. Voting is important, but it is not the full stop of political engagement. Who writes their congressperson today? What about calling their office? What about going to town halls where you can engage them directly? And the engagement is not just at the federal level. Nay. There are state and municipal representatives that need engagement as well, because all politics are local. My friends, I'm in my John McCain moment now. Speaking on the need for proper economic justice is a Herculean task, especially since the issues that Black people face are long and deep. Although it may seem insurmountable, it is still a task that should not be ignored or forgotten. We as a people will not survive without commitment from the powers that are over us to intervene. They won't do it, though, without our voices. And it can't just be African Americans saying this either. It has to be a critical mass of peoples recognizing that putting hand to plow to make this a reality. I, as a Black woman, can only do so much. It takes a village to make this happen. And also, please recognize that the upliftment of the Black community is an upliftment for America. Every transformative legislation that affects the social and economic makeup for America is because Black people said enough is enough. Time for reciprocity. Thank you. Any questions at all? Because I practice, so come on. Oh. Cynthia Robinson, yay! Any questions? Oh, for Evanston? No, for the country. Oh, you're talking about Robin Ruth Sivens? Oh, okay. Oh, okay. We'll talk about that later. Any other questions? One more. Okay. Oh, okay, cool. Technology. A lovely thing.
John Levin, if you can hear this, please unmute yourself.
I can, thank you.
Awesome.
Hi, been away most of the day, but really appreciated this talk. Speaking for some white allies and male white allies, what are the 2 or 3 things that you would most like to see us do?
What are the 2 or 3 things that I would like to see from white allies, specifically about this topic? Well, as the previous speaker spoke of, is that one of the things that white allies need to learn how to not do is get in the way. Oftentimes with the enthusiasm of saying, yeah, Black lives matter, which they do, oftentimes what ends up happening is that they get into a space where they start to kind of gatekeep what it is, when we're trying to talk about issues that happen within our community. And one of the things that, even as an HIV case manager, and I work with a lot of transgender people, is that we always talk about let these people who are in this community lead the way and you follow. So as white allies, what I would like for you all to see is let us who are in this space that is active, let us lead this space and you follow. So if we say, hey, we got this letter that we need for you to go ahead and submit to your Congress people about this particular policy, I just need you to say, okay. There you go. Thank you.